Well, as we begin our afternoon, Ann Garrido is our keynote speaker. She's written a lot of wonderful books. I'm amazed at how many books she's written. She can tell you about all of that. She's an associate professor of homiletics at the Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis, Missouri. While her first passion is teaching, for the past 15 years, she has found herself increasingly drawn into administrative roles, including at various points in time, serving as the school's director of the D-Min in preaching, the director of the MAPS, Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. Who's here from that? I know there are people here associated with the Good Shepherd. Director of Field Education, Director of Distance Learning, and Director of the Aquinas Ministry Integration Project. That's a lot of doing.
Not all at one time.
Congratulations. She served as the senior editor of the Human Development magazine and has authored 6 books, including Redeeming Administration, which was published by Ave Maria Press in 2013. I know there's a lot of business administrators. Carl, lots of business administrators use that book in our diocese a couple years back for discussion. Redeeming Conflict, a newer book, Ave Maria Press, 2016. And Ann now commits half time to traveling nationally and internationally, doing conflict education and mediation work. Not that any of us would have any conflict, right? No, I know. She works with the Triad Consulting Group, founded by 2 members of the Harvard Negotiation Project based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She is married, very patient husband, she says, and has 1 college-age son who plays a mean ukulele, she said. I'd like to hear him, so next time we have to bring him. Welcome, Ann Garrido.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Oh, so how many of you envy me having to stand up here after Jack this morning? And the afternoon hours, nonetheless. So Jack gave an incredibly motivational talk, and every time that I am privileged to hear Jack speak, every single time that this happens to me, I want to go out and I want to set the entire world on fire. And then, as usual, I find that I get stuck with like the second half of today's gospel. I have come not to bring peace, but to bring division. And it kind of reminds me of what seems to happen to me a lot on the home front also, where my husband gets the kids like all excited and all wound up, and then I'm the one who has to take them to the emergency room. It's all fun and games until somebody singes themselves. And we don't think much about that part of ministry when we get into it, do we? I know that I certainly did not think about that when I was entering into church work as a profession. I grew up in a really large Catholic family also. In fact, I'm the oldest of 8 kids. And we were that Catholic family that would oftentimes sit in the very front pew of church each Sunday. And one of my favorite seasons of the year was during the season of Easter, because you would sit and you would listen to the stories from the book of Acts. And I remember shortly in that, right before Pentecost each year, hearing that story about how all of the people would sit and they'd listen at the feet of the disciples. And when the Spirit swept through that room in that form of fire and the disciples went out and preached, people would listen to them, and then they like laid over all of their money. They were all baptized, and then they lived happily ever after. And my dad was an accountant, and he would often come home from work at the end of the day looking kind of worn by some of the tensions that were going on in his office place, and some of the exacerbated by some of the human resource issues that he would have to manage. And I remember thinking at a very early age, you know what? When I grow up, I think I'll go work for the church, because that's where people live happily ever after. And so at the age of 14, I began my illustrious career as the after-school receptionist at our parish rectory. And at that point in time, we had 4 priests who lived there, and a convent full of sisters next door, and a burgeoning Catholic school right across the parking lot. And already by the age of 15, even though I didn't quite have this language at that point, I came to realize that priests might have different ecclesiologies, that sometimes sisters yell, that keys get lost, that the gym gets double booked, and that absolutely nobody wants to empty out the dishwasher. And by the age, probably the climax of my teen career in the church was when I was 17, and I was on staff the night of Easter Vigil, and our parish maintenance man decided to light the building on fire over some dismay around a restructuring project that he was not all that happy about. Talk about lighting your church on fire. Yeah. And by the age of 18, I was pretty cynical and was like, I think we've come a really far way from the book of Acts. And probably what rescued me at that point in time was a little bit later when I began graduate studies in theology, and I began to study for the first time really the letters of Paul. And what we found when we began to read those letters of Paul was that Jesus was barely burst forth from the tomb, and what we hear in those letters is that already the church was experiencing tension. That already, we think Paul's letter is written somewhere between 44 and 60 AD, whereas the book of Acts not written until somewhere around 90 AD. So already Paul's letters being the earliest literature that we have of the church, and what we discover is that there's already arguments around the role of women in the church. There's already tensions around how ministers are going to be paid. There's already tensions around who can come to the table and who not. And yet, 2,000 years later, some of those same arguments going on, and the church continues to go on. And you wonder, well, how could this possibly be? It turns out that conflict's not necessarily totally a bad thing. When I was growing up, the image that I had in my mind was that if there was tension in your community, that must be the result of sin. And sin, as we know, definitely can escalate tensions, bringing them to the level of bitterness and violence and arson in your school basement. But that the tensions that exist in a community are not in themselves sinful. Indeed, what we discover if we go all the way back, this might be a sign of life within a community. Sofield and Giuliano did a study of U.S. communities, parish communities. This was maybe 20 years ago. And one of the things that they discovered was that when they interviewed pastors, and pastors said, oh no, my parish, we don't have any conflict going on here, that more likely than not, that parish was comatose rather than vital. Because people only argue about what they care about. And if nobody in your parish community is arguing, that's a really bad sign. One of my friends is a vocation director for religious community. When she's trying to help them to articulate their charism to recruit further members of their community, one of the things that she asks them all the time is, tell me what it is that you fight about. Because she said, each religious community, you can identify their charism if you find out what it is that they argue about, because that's what they have the most passion about. She said, Benedictines, every time they get together for their general meeting, they're arguing about a balance of work and prayer. Franciscans, always arguing about, are we living poverty well or not? Right? So whatever it is that's most core to you, it's going to be what it is that you're going to have the most tension around. John Gottman, very interesting research that's being done on healthy marriages. And one of the things that he's discovered with his wife is that on average, what you want is about 1 negative interaction for every 5 positive interactions. That marriages that have more interactions that are negative than that, those marriages are oftentimes in danger, but the greatest danger to marriage was in marriages that showed only like a 1 in 10. Because oftentimes people do have tensions, but they've stopped talking about them. So the question, I think, for us is not how do we douse the fire that exists within our community, because we do not want to live in apathetic communities, but rather how, as we develop these missional skills that Jack was talking about this morning, how do we develop complementary, what I'm going to call some first aid skills that are necessary for us to be able to live really passionate lives well? So how do we have our conflicts? How do we have our tensions, our disagreements with one another? All of these being signs of life, but can we do so in such a way that people don't end up getting so hurt? Is it possible that we could actually use the tensions that exist within our community to build up the community rather than to fragment us and send us in 1,000 different directions? Now, that's about as theoretical as I'm going to get during the session that I have with you this afternoon. I want to move to being utterly practical with you. And in order to do that, I'm going to need you to turn to someone right next to you. Just find a partner that you're going to work with for the next hour. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes. And I want you to talk about with your partner. Tell your partner about what are the things that the people in your community are so passionate about that sometimes it gets a little toasty. So what are the things that emerge within your parish setting that you guys find you got a little bit of tension around? And think of a conversation, let this conversation help you to have one particular surface in your own mind. All right, so whatever surfaced in that very brief 2 moments, on the handout in front of you, this is going to be just for you. You don't have to share this with anybody else. But I need you to, hopefully that triggered in your mind a particularly tense conversation or maybe an ongoing tension in your own head, that in the far left column on that handout, just write down one tense conversation that you're in the middle of in your ministry that you would be willing to think about a little bit over the course of the next hour. And what we're going to do is think all the way through this, see if we can open it up, get any more understanding as to what's going on in that particular conversation. Maybe make some headway on it before we leave this afternoon. So just jot that down. And then do you see how right underneath it, there's a space where it says, I want you to think about what you look like when you're really effective in this conversation. So what kinds of things are you doing in the conversation when it's going well? When you're coming across as the kind of minister that you want to be in that moment, in the middle of this tension? And just think about how you would describe yourself. Any samples that you've got of, any samples that you've got of what you look like when you're really effective in the middle of a tension? Just raise your hand real loud. I'll give you a hint. For myself, one of the things is I consider myself to be really effective if I'm not babbling. Like coherent. Coherent is like I like to come across. Anything else you like to do? Yeah. Yeah, I'm actively listening to the other person. I'm really hearing what it is that they're saying. What else are you doing that you consider to be really effective? Reflecting back to them, maybe. Or maybe you've got some space in your brain where you're able to let it sink in at a deeper level. Consider that to be effective. What's your body doing? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I'm a little bit vulnerable in those situations. Like I'm really open to hearing what the other person has to say, even if it might be hard. I consider that to be effective. Yeah. Okay, so I'm validating the other person. I'm being empathetic. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a trustee and I came out of a business environment. And so what I quickly learned with the parishes are business, but they're not really a business.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to be careful applying business practices which you got to
Yeah. So is there anything in particular that you do in a parish setting you consider effective?
Yeah, I think I was in HR for my whole career.
Okay.
What I learned in the business world is really relevant.
Okay. Thanks. Now I want you to think about I bet that most of the time you do show up that way, or else you wouldn't continue to hold the jobs that you do. Like, you are here because you're effective. But every once in a while, I imagine that you show up for work and you're in this conversation and you're ineffective. Just jot down a couple of adjectives for yourself. What do you look like when you're ineffective? How do you show up? So for myself, I start to babble. Right? I lose my coherency. What do you do that you consider ineffective? Yeah. I stop listening. I no longer am hearing what the other person's saying. A daydream. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I begin to become resistant, and that shows up oftentimes in my body language, like, mm-hmm. Yeah. Ah, interesting. I stop seeing the person face to face and I go out to media in all caps. Yeah. How many of you would say I totally shut up and I stop talking altogether? Yeah. How many of you would say I start monologuing? How many of you would say I start monologuing? Okay, you can hear me? Okay, I'm repeating everything the persons are saying. I'll try to keep repeating it, yeah. So sometimes we'll monologue, we'll start going like I'll talk more and more and more and more. Yeah. We all have different ways of showing up ineffective. Do you choose that? Do you say in the middle of one of these tense conversations, you know what? I think right now, I'll go ineffective because that worked so well for me last time. Yeah. No, something happens that moves you from being these really effective ministers that you know yourself to be on a regular basis. What I'm going to call your green zone, something moves you into this red zone where you're like, this isn't who I want to be. And what I want to think about today in this coming hour is, what is it that moves us from being effective to ineffective? Because if we could figure that out, we might get some clue as to what kind of first aid skills that we need to develop. Now, one of the things which I'll just say head up is that oftentimes we begin to model these red zone behaviors, these ineffective behaviors, because the other person began to model them first, right? And red zone behaviors are extremely contagious. So the other person begins to not listen, the other person begins to monologue, the other person begins to be deer in headlight, and all of a sudden, we slide into that. So one of the things that we'll also want to think about is, if all of a sudden the other person moves into the red zone, are there some things that I can do to bring them back over to their green zone as well? Because this is a much easier place to be communicating with that person. Now, in order to do that, what we need to do is to understand a little bit better the dynamics of what makes these conversations that we're having so tense in the first place. And in order to do that, what I need is 2 volunteers, and the only thing that you got to be able to do and to volunteer for this is to be able to read out loud. We'll even give you a microphone for this one, so that everybody can hear. Anybody ready to volunteer? Oh, thank you. Okay. So, yeah, excellent. Would you mind coming up into this space? And we're going to have you, there we go. Phil's going to bring you the microphone. Okay, you can come on up to the ambo if you want a microphone so that you're even. Tell me your name.
Hello.
John Clark.
John, I'm glad to meet you. And tell me.
Chris.
Chris, okay. John and Chris. Now, those of you guys who did not volunteer fast enough, you got the much harder job. So, John and Chris are going to open the newspaper to any article that they find interesting, and they're going to read to us about a 30-minute snippet, but what they're going to do is they're going to read to us at the exact same time. And your job is that you need to listen and understand everything that John and Chris say. Okay, you got 30 seconds to pick it up. Ready? John and Chris, set, go.
Who was the real Martin Luther?
Oh,
Cliffhanger.
give me 1 second. All right, now go.
Who was the real Martin
Go ahead
Luther?
and read.
500 years ago this month, Augustinian Saxon
Keep
priest. Martin Luther, an obscure
well,
university professor in Germany, rose to
rescuing
prominence and
vocations
became a
through
household name in
the
Christendom.
LaBrosse
From one moment
Society,
500 years ago,
donors
Luther,
expressed reasons
initially
behind
known
their
only by his
support.
family, friends, and academic
Vocations
colleagues,
profile.
became one of the most studied
After
and
3
written
years
about
of
individuals in
teaching
the
in
history of
junior high
Western
school,
civilization.
Bill Dufford
Indeed, one biographer of
answered
Luther
a call
boasted,
to the
in most big
priesthood.
libraries,
He was
books by
cleared
and
for
about Martin Luther
acceptance
occupied
into
more
Okay,
the
stop.
seminary.
space.
John and Chris can stop. Thank you very much for volunteering. Thank you. I've got yours is right here, right? Okay, hold on to it. Yeah, if you can shout loud, you can stay from here. All right, how many of you guys heard everything John and Chris were reading? What? That was the instructions. What did you hear? What did you hear? Martin Luther, vocations, mission. How many of you say, I heard nothing? Okay. How many of you would say, I heard one person? A little bit? Yeah, who did you hear more? Over here, Chris. Any idea why you heard Chris more? He started a little bit earlier, so he got your ear faster. Yeah, no, that's all right. It was my fault in directions. How many? Would you guys say you even understood what you read? Sort of, kind of. Would you say, John, you even understood what you read?
I was interested, actually. Not that I understood it, but I was interested.
Yeah, he said he was interested in it. Yeah. How many of you would say? Well, you may. That can be your reward for volunteering. You may. And you can even keep yours too, if you would like. Thank you guys for doing that. So. No, it's for you. It can be for you now. The reason why we do this is because it illuminates something about what makes conversation so tough. You might say it models what happens in a difficult conversation, in that in a tough conversation, in a tense conversation, what you've got is you've got two voices going off at the same time. And on one hand, you might say, well, yeah, because of course, there's two people involved in this conversation. That's not actually what I'm talking about. Each of us in our very own bodies has two voices. So each of us has an external voice, which is what the rest of the outside world can hear. And then each of us also has an internal voice. And the internal voice is the running tape that's going through your mind all of the time. So just for a second, get in contact with your internal voice. It might be saying something like, oh, that was a good turkey sandwich. I wonder if we get another break. I don't know what she's talking about. I don't have an internal voice. Okay, you found your internal voice. So most of the time, your internal voice is pretty quiet. It says things like, oh, interesting. But the nature of a tough conversation is that what happens is your internal voice gets turned up to full volume. So that all of a sudden, the other person's speaking, and you're trying to listen to what it is that they're saying. You're trying to be active listener, but all of a sudden, your own internal voice gets louder, 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 and the exact same thing happens as what just happened to us when we were trying to listen to both John and Chris at the same time, which is, I can't hear hardly anything. And either what happens is I toggle back and forth, and I catch a word here and a word there, but I can't catch the fullness of what either one is saying. Or I end out blocking out one voice entirely and just listening to the other one, which often is the one that maybe got started first, or the one that's a little bit more interesting to me, or the one that's a little bit louder. And let's admit, your internal voice has the home court advantage, right? Or we end up just becoming dismayed, and we get, like all the people who raise their hand in the back, just like deer in the headlight, like I don't even hear either voice. I can't grasp either one anymore at all. Now, two complicating factors that happen in a tricky conversation is, one, they also have an internal voice. So you've got two people in a conversation, you've got 4 potential voices going off. Staff meeting, 10 people in the conversation, 20 potential voices going off. But the other thing that's kind of tricky about it is, especially for those of us who live in polite cultures, especially those of us who are going to work for a place like the church, oftentimes there's a gap between our internal voice and our external voice. So your pastor, bishop, supervisor of some sort comes with this brilliant new idea about how you're going to light the world on fire, and out of your mouth, because you're a polite person and you'd like to keep your job, you say, "Great idea." And then your internal voice in the back of your head, you're thinking, "Have you lost your mind?" Right? And so oftentimes, the bigger the gap is between our internal voice and our external voice, the harder the conversation's going to become for us. So what we've got is we've got two challenges that are going to be before us. One is, if we really want to be successful in handling a conversation around a tricky topic well, we've got to be able to figure out what's in the other person's internal voice. Because what is it that's really going to be driving the show? What is it that's really going to be motivating their actions? Are you curious about what they say they're going to do, or are you curious about what their head's actually thinking? How many of you have ever run some sort of social justice drive on a Saturday? We're all going to pack up these canned goods or whatever and go on the other side of 9th Street and bring them over there, and people are like, "Oh, yeah, I'm going to do that." And then you're the only one that shows up. And do you want to know what they say, or do you want to know what is actually going on inside of their head? So one of the biggest challenges you have to overcome as a minister in order to be effective in these conversations is you have to figure out how to get what's in the other person's internal voice out. But the other challenge that you got to work with is you're going to have to negotiate with your own internal voice so that you can tune the dial a little bit so that it can be more of your friend in the conversation rather than your nemesis. Because what I would say is just closing that gap is the quickest way to the unemployment line, isn't it? It's not just a question of saying everything that comes to your head. It's more a question of, how do I work with my internal voice so that I can work with it so that it asks the kinds of questions that will help make this conversation go in a more constructive way. Now, the internal voice, what we know, if we befriend our internal voice for just a minute, is that the internal voice is always going on around some real common things. So back to that handout that's in front of you for just a moment. You see where it has the box where there's these two little figures speaking? And the one which says, think about that tough conversation that you brought up in your own head already, that you just wrote down on the page a minute ago. And what I want you to do in that left column there, where it says, what am I thinking and feeling, is just do a dump. No one's going to see this but you. Dump down everything that's going through your own internal voice about this tension. If you could say everything you ever wanted to say, what's inside of your internal voice about this conversation? And just take a couple seconds and just dump that all down in there. Okay, so several years ago, two friends of mine were working on a book, and the original title of the book that they had gotten a contract to write was called The 10 Hardest Things to Say and How to Say Them. And they thought, at the time that they got this contract, that there were going to be about 10 really difficult conversations that people had over and over again. They thought, well, there'll be a chapter on handling conversations around, divorce. A chapter around handling conversations where someone has to get laid off. Maybe a separate volume on handling conversations with raising a teenager. But what they discovered was that they weren't quite sure what those 10 hardest conversations were. So they began to go out and interview people to find out, well, what are the 10 hardest conversations that people have got? And what they found out in doing these interviews was there are no 10 hardest conversations. There were 1,000 difficult conversations, 10,000 difficult conversations. Everybody had their own difficult conversation. But what they found out was when they interviewed people, even though different people found different conversations difficult, when they found them difficult, it was always for the same 3 reasons. So if they found them tough, these were the three things that were always going on in the internal voice of the person who is finding them tough. The first one is that the internal voice cares a whole lot about getting the story right. So the internal voice cares a whole lot about making sure that the other person sees things as they should be seen, and that the fact that the other doesn't see them in the way that I see them is evidence that they do not have the right story in their head. So their version of the story is somehow incomplete. It might be erroneous. They don't have the whole picture of reality. And they're saying things, and our internal voice is going off and being like, that's not right. This isn't my fault. I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that to happen. So just look at your own internal voice narrative for a minute, and can you see, is that in the internal voice in there? Some sense that this is not right, that the other person's version of the story is not correct. And maybe with your pen or a pencil, just kind of highlight where you'd be like, oh yeah, my internal voice is worried about that. That the other person doesn't quite have the right picture of reality. The story's not correct. Okay, nod with me if you would say, yeah, that actually is in my internal voice. That somehow the story that the other person's got is not right. Yeah. The second thing that's always running through the internal voice is that the internal voice has some pretty strong feelings involved in it. Even if it's not especially explicit in what you wrote, just step one step back from what it is that you've listed on the paper and note the feelings that are underneath what it is that you have written. Frustration, disappointment, irritation. And maybe you're wishing, like, I wish those things weren't actually there, but they are there, and that's part of what makes us human, is that we have feelings. So just highlight, is there any place in the narrative that you wrote where you could circle and be like, oh yeah, there's a feeling there. If I just step one step back. And then the third thing that the internal voice is always getting really, really loud about is the internal voice cares a whole lot about identity. The internal voice cares a lot about how personally we are showing up in the world, and we're worried about how it is that we show up in the world. And again, it might not be explicit in what you wrote, but if you take another step back, peel back the layer underneath what it is that you wrote about what those feelings are, why are those feelings there? Because I like to show up in the world fundamentally as good, as competent, and as lovable. And at least one of those is being thrown up in the air in this conversation, or it wouldn't be tough for me. So just see in your own conversation, what is being threatened there for you? Your sense of being good? Your sense of being competent? Your sense of being lovable? Is one of those being questioned? This question of we've got different stories of what we think is right what's going on in this situation we view differently. Feelings and identity are the three common threads that run through all of these tense conversations. And so what ended up happening was that the title of the book that my friends ended up writing ended up not being the 10 hardest things and how to say them, but just difficult conversations. Because these are the threads that run all the way through. Now, what I want to do in this remaining time that we've got is let's just talk about one tip. We're just skimming the tip of the iceberg here, but let's just talk about one thing that we can do regarding each of these three conversations. So one thing that we can do regarding the way that we tell stories differently, one thing we can do about feelings, and one thing we can do with identity. And hopefully get a little bit of insight into the conversation that we brought. So the tips I'm going to talk about is 1, step down the ladder of inference, 2, don't avoid feelings, and 3, have a conversation with yourself about yourself. The first point, step down the ladder of inference. That you probably are thinking, that's brilliant, step down the ladder of inference. It would be brilliant if I knew what the ladder of inference was. So let me just step back there and define my terms a little bit. Ladder of inference, this was a term that was coming up within the 1970s by a professor at MIT. His name is Chris Argyris, who is working in a lot of business settings. And he was examining what happens within a business, like how is it that all these people work for the same company, they're dealing with a lot of the same issues, and when you get them into a meeting with each other, very quickly it fragments into 1,000 different directions. And how is it that people who share so much in common can arrive at radically different conclusions? And what he did in that was he created a model that looks at what are the stages that the human brain goes through in order to reach a conclusion. So one of the things Argyris pointed out was he would say, we are surrounded, we are swimming all the time in like just a sea of data. All around us, even if we were just to limit ourselves to what we could be picking up and absorbing in this environment right now. You could be absorbing the sound of my voice. You could be looking at the color of the walls or the faint hum of the heating cooling system. Or you could be looking at the number of slats on the ceiling, right? One of my friends one time was talking about the ladder of inference, and he said, you could be like counting the number of ceiling tiles on the ceiling. And this guy in the back of the room goes, 482. Which, let me just tell you, if you're a presenter, that's like one of the worst things that can ever happen to you. Because what would happen in your internal voice at that moment in time? What would your internal voice think? How boring must I be, right? If you're counting ceiling tiles instead of listening to me. But he said to him in reply, how do you know that? And the man said, he goes, I'm sorry. I used to be a ceiling tile salesman. I'm used to going into like a grocery store. It drives my wife nuts. We'll be shopping for soup, and I'll be like, we could do this for 10 boxes, $8,000. We could have the whole job done. What the guy did, it actually illuminated perfectly the ladder of inference, because there is an immense amount of data out there, but without us even knowing it, our brain pre-selects some of the data to pay attention to, and others of it we let go by the wayside. And all of us who are seated here in this church today, by socialization, from a very early age, you were probably taught, listen to the voice in the front of the room before counting the ceiling tiles. The kids who counted the ceiling tiles probably didn't end up in your seat, right? They're doing other things in life. So we're not even aware of the fact of how we've been socialized to bias or privilege some data more than other data and consider that's the stuff to be paying attention to. Now, once we pick the data that we're going to pay attention to, then what happens, the next layer is we add our own interpretation, our own meaning to it. And then from there, we share at the level of conclusion. So our brain works from the bottom up really, really fast. When I think about those levels of meaning and interpretation, this is why you could walk out of here, it's kind of a cloudy day out there. Maybe there's a sun will break through. There might be a rainbow. And two of us could go home having seen the exact same thing, having picked the same data to pay attention to when we walk out the door. And one of us will say, I saw a really interesting meteorological event outside today. And the other one of us will say, God gave me a sign of hope. We have different meaning and interpretation that we can add to the exact same data that we have selected to look at. A typical pattern in really tough conversations is that we only have the conversation at the top rung of the ladder. So we get in, let's do an example from parish life. Of all the stuff that's going on Sunday Mass, I look around and I notice there's a lot fewer teenagers here than there used to be when I was a youth in this parish. When I was young, there used to be more teenagers at Mass. Indeed, I really liked Mass when I was a teen because we had this really great youth group and we had this really great young priest who made Mass very meaningful for us. And the kids now, they're not coming because the preaching and the music is in no way at their level. And we should think about having a special youth Mass on Sunday nights. So once that's when my brain has moved through to move to that level of conclusion, now a pattern is that my brain will begin to look for reinforcing data. So we do a survey of the whole parish and 1,000 different results come back, but one of them comes back, and when we're reading through all the data, one teen says, I feel left out. I would like a Mass, a special Mass. And we're like, see? See? Like, that's the most important survey of the entire 1,000. That's the one we have to pay attention to. So we will now have a leaning toward treating more importantly any data that reinforces what it is that we already think. But the other thing is that once we reach a conclusion, we'll tend to just share at that conclusion level. So I say at the meeting, instead of sharing my whole ladder of inference, what I do is I'll say, I think we should reinstitute a youth mass on Sunday nights. And then the sole overworked pastor, eyes bulge out, and looks like he's about to blow a gasket. So the temptation, when our brilliant observation around what we could do to fix this problem isn't immediately resolved, is we will tend to move immediately into advocacy mode, which means that I'll begin to give you more reasons why I'm right. Like, you obviously are not persuaded by all the reasons that I already said, so let me share with you now this survey, this one additional survey. And you're still not persuaded. Let me give you more reasons why I'm right. Well, what ends up happening is when we move into advocacy mode, what we're doing is nothing sets off the internal voice of the other person faster than us moving into advocacy mode. So now, all of a sudden, I've got all these brilliant reasons that I've given, but it turns out that reason isn't what actually persuades the other person. My reasons have only turned up the volume on their internal voice so that they can no longer hear what it is that I'm saying. Instead, they've moved into the two readers exercise, and they're toggling back and forth, and they're hearing a word here and a word there, but they're not catching the fullness of anything, or they're just listening to one voice and not to the other any longer. So the question is, what do I do? How do I break through that? And that's where if I can move and shift from being in an advocacy mode to moving into that space of inquiry, shifting my internal voice from asking the question, not why am I right, but why do we see this differently? Because in other situations, you seem to be a relatively sane person. So why in this moment are the two of us looking at this so very differently? Is it because somehow we each have different data? Is it because actually we're picking different data to pay attention to and deciding that which is most important? Is it because we're interpreting it differently? We think it means something differently? Like, where has the breakdown happened? So the kinds of questions, if I can tune my internal voice away from saying, I'm right, to saying, why do we see this differently? It could be asking questions like, tell me what you think I'm missing. So when I suggest, let's do an additional mass, what information do you think that I'm missing? Like, what are you seeing that you think I'm not seeing? This has been my observations. How are you observing it? What are you paying attention to? What's really important that needs to be brought up in this conversation here? What's your read as to why we have so few teens come into Mass? One of the questions that my supervisor oftentimes asks me that gets to the heart of the matter really fast, what is it that you're worried about here? Tell me a little bit about what you're afraid would happen if we did this. That gets the internal voice of the other person out on the table really, really quickly. So the purpose here is that it gives us a little bit more information, and it calms down the other person's internal voice so that they're going to be able to hear a little bit better when we share from our own lower rungs of that ladder. So looking at your scenario, turn back to your partner just for a minute and see if you can come up with one really good question that you could ask the other person that you do not actually know the answer to. But what would you ask them if you wanted to find out more about what was in their internal voice? What's at these lower rungs of this ladder? Just 2 minutes, share with your partner. This is a question that I think might work here that I would be willing to ask the other person. All right, you got a good question that you might be willing to ask the person? Maybe your partner gave you another idea too. That's something that would work. Tip number 2, don't avoid the feelings. Now, on one hand, there's probably in your own internal voice that says something along the lines of like, yeah, if I wanted to deal with feelings, I wouldn't have gone to seminary, right? I wouldn't have gone to theology school. Like, this is not what I got in for. And we do have a little bit of a sense in the work environment, including even in the church work environment. Yeah, go ahead, you can come on in and then like check your feelings at the door with the parish receptionist and then do your job, and then you can pick them up again on the way out and take them home for your spouse to enjoy, but we just won't feel here, right? We won't feel here. Now, when I say that though, one of the things that you recognize right from the very beginning is like, yeah, that doesn't work, right? We don't decide to have feelings. Feelings are in our body. Nobody here said, you know what, I think I'll laugh now. I mean, it's an impulse that happens from within us. So feelings aren't something that we get to decide whether or not we're actually going to have them. Feelings are actually rooted in physical sensation. And while the temptation might be to say, when I'm in a tough conversation, well, let's just leave the feelings out of it and we'll just talk about the facts. A challenge with that would be feelings actually are fact. Feelings are physical sensations that go on within our body, and that they are actually part of the fact. And further on, if we didn't have feelings, this wouldn't be a tough conversation in the first place. So if you don't have any feelings about it, this probably didn't make it onto your tension chart. It didn't make it in the left column that you were writing about. Because if you didn't have any feelings about it, you wouldn't even be remembering it right now. So it's not the question of how do we get rid of the feelings or put them off to the side. The question is, how do we actually engage the feelings in a really constructive way? Oftentimes, we pit feeling against fact, and all of the stuff that's coming out in neuroscience right now is we pit feeling against reason, as if like feelings may be in my body and reasons up here in my head. All the stuff that's coming out in neuroscience right now seems to indicate actually that feeling might be in some way in vitamin form the wisdom of all generations, all of our ancestors leading up to the present moment, in order to help us to make good decisions really, really fast. So if, for example, I don't know right now, like a tiger walks into the room, and if I have an impulse in my body to flee that scenario, and I run off, I live on to see another day and to pass on my genetic material to a next generation. Whereas those generations in the past which said, oh, isn't that an interesting cat? They did not live on to pass on their genetic material, right? And so what ends up happening is that when we have a feeling in our body, oftentimes it's a really big clue to us, pay attention. Something is going on in this moment, which all of history has said, this is probably in some way, shape, or form important for your survival and well-being and flourishing as a human being. So that if you have strong emotional reaction to something, it's probably, there's a reason why that is. So one of the questions, though, is, what do I do when I have really, really strong feelings about something? What is it that's behind that for me? I can ask myself, what is it that's feeling threatened right now? What am I concerned about? What am I frightened about? What am I finding intimidating in this conversation? And just ask myself that. It's not a question of getting rid of the feeling, but figuring out how to best use these feelings to move the conversation forward in a fruitful way. And often, one of the ways that you can do that is just by naming the feeling that you've got going on inside of you. Now, I know often that seems like an unprofessional thing to do, to actually name feelings as part of a tense conversation with a parishioner or so forth. But I think one of the things that oftentimes we forget in the workplace is that we're human. Many of you, I'm sure, have experience working with children who at some point in time or another have told you that they think you live in the classroom, right? That they think you sleep there. That's where you live. And I think many of our parishioners beyond children, think that about us as well, that we live in our offices, that we're constantly in this role, and they forget that we actually are human beings and that we do have emotions. And being able to say out loud and name what it is that we're feeling releases some of the tension in the internal voice. Naming feelings humanizes us, and it reminds people that it's a real person that they're dealing with real limitations. But at the same time, naming feelings is not the same thing as getting emotional. So it's very, very possible to say, I'm frustrated by this situation without slamming the door. It's possible to say, this makes me really sad, or I was disappointed when you didn't show up on Saturday. And that saying, I'm disappointed, it's not the same thing as wailing and gnashing of teeth. So there's a difference between naming emotion and being emotional. One of the things that we want to be really careful about when we begin to name our feelings in conversation is that oftentimes we switch to a language of feeling without really naming feelings, and we're still using a language of judgment or a language of accusation. So as someone said to me once, I tried that thing that you told me about feelings, and I went home and I said, I feel like you're acting like a jerk, and it didn't go well. So whenever your word feel is immediately followed by the word like or that, you haven't yet reached the naming of the feeling. You're still at the level of judgment or the level of accusation. If you can replace the word feel with the word think and your sentence still makes sense, you've not arrived at the level of feeling. So I feel like we should cancel Sunday school. Okay, I could say, I think we should cancel Sunday school, and it says that it means the same thing, that it's not feeling. So I feel sad. I can't say, I think sad. Does that make sense? So part of it is just trying to figure out, how is it that I could actually name what it is that's at stake for me here? The challenge is the other person in this conversation, oftentimes the coworker or the parishioner or the pastor that you're dealing with, they are not likely to have gotten that message around, like, let's just name the feeling that's in this for us. Instead, their feelings are going to come out in the form of accusations or in form of judgment. So you're going to hear things come at you like, you just don't care about the teens. Judgment. But what you can do in these conversations is to do a reframe. It sounds like you're worried that the teens of this parish are being left out. People like me bring up great ideas all the time, but you never follow through on any of them, and that's the reason why our church is declining. It sounds like you feel frustrated by my lack of response on the teen mass, maybe other things as well. Tell me about that. So you're shifting from an accusation to name the feeling that's underneath there. And note when I say those reframing things, I'm hedging my bets around how you don't want to tell another person how they feel. You're mad. No, it sounds like you're mad, or it sounds like, or I'm picking up this. I'm not entirely sure, but maybe you could tell me more about that. Someone sitting across from you. I'm picking up defensiveness. I don't know that for sure. I mean, maybe it's just cold, but I don't know that. But that's what I'm reading. Tell me if I'm wrong. What is it that you're actually feeling? Oftentimes, when the other person's able to express what it is that's at stake for them, that's coming through in their feelings, it turns down some of the volume of that internal voice so that they're able to hear again better. So let me pause there again just for a moment and have you share with your partner, in this conversation that you've written about, you don't need to share the conversation itself, but what is it that you think you are feeling about it? And what do you suspect the other person has going on in terms of feeling? What's at stake for them? What are they feeling? Again, just 2 minutes to think that through. All right, you identified some good feeling words?
I'm very frustrated with the 2
John wants you to know he's very frustrated with my 2 minutes, that I'm maybe not counting this correctly. It's a possibility.
What are you feeling like?
I know. Third point, and this will be the closing one. Have a conversation with yourself about yourself. So, at the beginning of this, I said that third one had to do with identity, that all of us like to think of ourselves as good, as competent, and lovable people, but we can push that a little bit further. All of us have a way that adjectives, positive adjectives, that we attribute to ourselves. So just for a moment, share with your partner, what is one thing that you know to be true about yourself that's a good thing? So I'll give you an example. What I know about myself is I know that I'm hardworking. All right? So just come up with that one word and tell your partner what that one word is. Okay, so does everybody have one word? If not, your partner can help you think of one. But you got to have one word in your head for yourself. All right. Next, think of the opposite of that word. So if I said for myself I was hardworking, the opposite of that would be lazy. Right? So think of the opposite. All right. So here's my hypothesis. That the conversations that all of us value these certain things about ourselves, these are high values. They tend to be things we value about ourselves. They'll tend to be something that we value in other people as well. And so the behavior in others that will irritate us the most is the behavior that goes contrary to what we believe to be good and true about ourselves. So for myself, I will have a particular sensitivity toward people who I see not pulling their weight. Like those people will irritate me in a particular way. But here's the second part of that theory. The conversations that I will find toughest to have are the conversations in which it is insinuated that I am not who I like to think of myself being. The conversations that are toughest for me are the ones that insinuate that I am not showing up the way that I like to show up. So if I said for myself that I am hardworking, any conversation that insinuates that I'm lazy or that I didn't pull my weight are the ones that will cause particular reaction within me. Now, that varies from person to person. So for some of us, like if the thing that you named for yourself as your positive attribute was sensitive, the conversations that are going to be toughest for you are those that insinuate. And the person doesn't even have to say you are insensitive. It's just that even just the context could imply that you should have been more sensitive here. Those are the things that are going to raise your hackles. Those are the things that are going to be the toughest conversation for you. I have lived most of my life in academia. I'm not sure it's true, but I like to think of myself as intelligent. I'm pretty good at school stuff. For me, anytime that I got a low grade on stuff, those were really tough conversations. My beloved son, that is not his identity. He could bring home a C+, and I would be like, oh, and he's like, that's not who I am, right? But you say something insulting around my son, he's an excellent musician. He plays the mean ukulele, right? Anything that insinuates that he doesn't know music, for him, those are really tough conversations to have because we value different things. So each of us is going to have a different, what we could call, identity trigger. When our identity does get triggered, those are the conversations which, over and over again, if you look at that really tough conversation in your life that you wrote down, somewhere in there, just check and say, hey, is my core, this thing that I just named, is that somehow at stake in this scenario that I just wrote down for myself? Just a little bit, if it's a real tough one. Not if you think that might be true. Yeah. So what tends to happen is that these are the when identity gets triggered, that makes the internal voice go really, really loud. And when my identity is triggered, I'll have a super hard time paying attention to anything that the other person is saying. And sometimes what I'll have to do in those scenarios is I have to have a space where I can have a conversation with myself about myself to give myself a little bit of time to calm down. So my internal voice will tend to go wild in one of two directions. Either it will become highly defensive, like, no, that's not me, you don't really know me, or you wouldn't be saying something like that. Or it moves in the other direction, which is where I become defenseless, like, oh my God, what if that is true? What if I'm a horrible person? I've always been a horrible person. I was horrible in my youth. I will be horrible until the end of days, right? You know that voice as well. And so when one learns a little bit about how your own identity triggers work, you will begin to recognize patterns in your own thinking. So for myself, if I'm stuck in a really tough conversation in which my identity has been stomped on, I know that I will spiral like a gerbil for the next 24 hours on that wheel. I'm not going to have a real clear thought for 24 hours. And then after 72 hours, I will stop thinking about it between 2 and 4 in the morning, replaying the conversation in my mind. And then about a week out, I will be normal. Like, I will be back to my baseline emotional thing. And so now what happens is when I'm in a really tough situation, if I've observed myself long enough, I can calm myself down in the moment, being like, self, this really is bad. And in 24 hours, it won't be so bad. And in a week, you're going to be fine. A year ago, this past summer, I got into a really tough argument with someone I love very deeply, and one of my best friends called me, and she said, "Are you okay yet?" And I said, "I'm not, but I will be in 18 hours and 36 minutes." And sure enough, in 18 hours and 36 minutes, that was about when it began to dissipate. So this last one, this balancing identity, this is something that we're working on all the time. It's not something that we're doing in the immediate moment so much as when we form really good friendships with people who can be honest with us but also supportive of us. Anything that we do to tend to our spirit, anything that we do to encourage having a balanced sense of self, the more that we do those things, the better we'll get at handling the identity part of these conversations. So there's probably a little piece of you right now that is thinking, yes, but these things are really hard and maybe they don't matter all that much because my job is to set the world on fire, and if people don't get this right, it's their loss, right? They can answer to God in the afterlife because about this I am clearly right. And there's a lot of things. I mean, that is true. But I want to close with a word about that afterlife that God oversees. So I mentioned in the very beginning of this session that while sin escalates the tensions that are among people to the level of bitterness and arson, the fact that tensions exist, this actually seems to be built into the fabric of creation. That when we look at the world around us, we see that our God apparently glories in diversity. That our God glories in creating a world of incredible diversity of species, but then within the human race, a diversity of race and culture and language and gender and political worldview, and that somehow that diversity seems to be built right into the plan of God. And we might ask, for why does it exist in the plan of God? What is its function? That possibly the inherent tension that comes among all of our differences, that in that friction, that's the way that God grows and evolves us as a human race, that through time we become the people that God dreams us to be. And we might ask, well, who are these people that God dreams us to be? What does God imagine for us? That we'd be able to become a people who are able to live communion in diversity. That we live we have a unity in the middle of our diversity, that our union doesn't erase the diversity, but that while remaining diverse, somehow that diversity doesn't separate us anymore, but that it molds us into a communion. And we might say, well, why communion and diversity, why does that matter so much to God? Because it is God's name. The communion and diversity is another way of saying Trinity. And that God and God's very being is Trinity. God and God's very being is relationship. And that each of us who have been baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, it's a way of saying, I have baptized you into relationship with me. And that anything that we can do as a church to heighten the capacities of our people to live relationship well, you are preparing them for eternal life, because that is what eternal life is a sharing in Trinitarian life. And that if we die and we do not have those capacities, it won't be eternal life, right? We are already, from baptism, we are already in our eternal life, and if we want to share the fullness of that life with God, if I haven't found some first aid way of healing the hurts that exist in communion and community, it won't be heaven until I figure those things out. These are the skills that we need, not just for life on earth. These are the skills we need to be able to enjoy communion and diversity forever and ever in heaven. So in that sense, heaven will not be heaven unless we learn what to do with fire. And it's true that we have to light fires, and it's also true that we have to learn how to tend them, to feed them, to blow them in some directions and not in others, to control them so that they can serve the kingdom of God and not destroy it. Fire is one of the greatest gifts that's given to us by God. And our task is to figure out, how am I going to steward that gift well? Amen.